Hello, ladies and gentlemen, philosophy students. This is review day before test number 2. I did send you the study guide a few days ago, but I also sent it again today, just so that you have it both in the email and attached as a Word document, whichever one is easier for you to use. As you'll recall, since our last test, we've covered the Apology, the Crito, and portions of the Republic. And as you should be able to see now, there are connections and overlaps between those three dialogues. Even though we didn't read all of the Republic, we read enough of it for you to get an idea of where those overlaps lie. Now then, what's most important? That's hard to say, because the test has not completely yet been constructed. In fact, it hasn't been constructed at all on paper. It still remains solely in my mind. However, you can sort of guess that some of the important things to be familiar with and to be able to explain, because this test is going to be different. It's not going to have probably not any objective portion at all. It's going to be all short answer and essay. So that means that while these questions are helpful, they're going to be helpful in a different way. You're going to have to know how to relate certain elements that appear in the dialogues. An example might be to relate the two different sets of charges to Socrates. Another example might be, how do you relate what happened at the trial of Socrates to what happened in the parable of the cave? Furthermore, obviously, you should be able to relate the parable of the cave to the analogy of the sun, as well as the simile of the divided line. Those three elements which constituted the peak of the Republic. In addition to that, obviously, you want to be able to relate elements of the Apology with elements of the Crito. Because remember, Socrates thought, when he was speaking to Crito, that he had already presented his best case as to why he could or should not escape from prison, or, which amounts to the same thing, why he should not accept exile. Socrates escape, Socrates exile, pretty much the same thing. So you want to clearly know why it is that Socrates argues he should not accept exile, and therefore why he should not escape. What arguments does Crito make? And those you should be familiar with, as well as the arguments that Socrates heard from the Laws toward the latter half of the dialogue of the Crito. Then you should be able, with regard to the Republic, to describe the progression of events, so to speak, the progression of how the Republic fits together. Now that you've seen it from the very beginning, and I'm sure that I'll be asking you what the first three words of the Republic are, not that those will be very hard to find out, but more specifically, I might ask you what those first three words of the Republic have to do with the rest of the Republic. How, for example, it relates to the training of the guardians, how it relates to the peak of the Republic, how it relates to Socrates' explanation of the four corrupted regimes. So there will be some tying together that I'm going to try to get you to do in this test, because we are in a little bit different waters, and so tests will have to look a little bit differently. Some of the questions here, you'll notice, are geared toward just simply answering them. So, for example, the first question at the beginning of Republic Book 2, which is number 22, actually says, what are the three kinds of good? Well, those are pretty easy to name. Those are pretty easy to see at the beginning of Book 2. So obviously I'm going to ask you a somewhat more detailed question about that. Why are those three categories important? Are they all three equally important? What do they mean? How do they apply again to the rest of the Republic? To what happens in the rest of Book 2, in Book 3 and 4, in Book 6 and 7 and 8, and even in Book 9, where, as we just saw last class, Socrates investigates the corruption of regimes from democracy to tyranny, and then he investigates the nature of the tyrannical man and what it is that characterizes not just the regime that he was calling tyranny, but the person who he's referring to as a tyrant. And furthermore, how those will relate to the image that Socrates has really been speaking of. You can now see Socrates has been speaking of this threefold or this tripartite image of the person throughout the whole Republic. And so those three kinds of good relate to that image. So you want to really be thinking of how do we tie things together. So when you study these questions, if you know these questions well, you will have the key with regard to how to tie all of these aspects together, from the Apology to the Crito through the Republic. Now, as usual, when you ask questions about certain aspects, I'll do my best to answer them. And as usual, of course, I'll try to answer them in such a way that it doesn't completely give away what questions and answers there might be on the test itself. You might remember previously from the first test, I gave you a little bit of a preview, how many of which types of objective questions, and then the essay questions. Since this isn't going to be that same kind of test, all that's going to be rolled into one when you actually get the test. Now, the test, obviously, you're taking remotely. You're not going to be taking it at the same time. And so you're going to be able to work on it at your own pace whenever it's convenient for you. And I'll get it to you sometime over the weekend, Sunday at the latest, I hope. And it'll need to be turned in by the end of the day on Monday, which is the day that we would have had the test. And then it'll probably take me a little bit longer to get those graded, but eventually I will. So at any rate, by all means, if you have questions, email back those questions. I hope that I've explained the structure of the test well enough that there doesn't really need to be a question about that. You know that the test will consist of short answers and essays, and that's about as far as I can go right now because I haven't actually written the test. But you should be familiar with all 80 of these questions, right? It's really not that many. We've gone through all of this. We've gone through a lot more than this. You remember for the first part of the Republic, I gave you a reading guide. You should also review that. You should also review any other handouts that I gave you. I believe there was one with the Apology, the structure of the outline of the Apology. I know there was a handout with regard to the three theories with regard to Plato's theory of forms. And I'm not sure if there was anything else in there, but if for whatever reason in all of the confusion you have misplaced any handouts between this in the second segment, between the first test and the second test, just let me know and I'll email those back to you so that you have those in preparation for the test. And if I get a few questions like that, I may just email them back to everyone. But if there's just one or two of you, I'll just email them back individually. So as I say, ask any questions. This is review time between whenever you receive this. Actually, I'm making this video on Wednesday, March 25th. the day on which some of you might be aware, this is the day on which a baby is conceived. And so that tells you what's going to happen exactly 9 months from today. You'll all be wishing each other a merry something or other 9 months from today. So today is a very important day. So you're getting this review, I hope, early enough that you'll have plenty of time to study and plenty of time to do very, very well on the test coming up, test number 2.